Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the launch of the 1 in 4 annual report for 2019. My name is David Holohan and I'm the chairperson of the board of 1 in 4 and I'm delighted so many of the stakeholders have taken the time to attend today. I'm joined by Maeve Lewis, Chief Executive of 1 in 4 and by Dr. Conor O'Mahony, Special Rapporteur on Child Protection. A small housekeeping matter to begin with. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask, please feel free to add it to the Q&A feature, which is just along the bottom of the Zoom session, and we'll be happy to answer it at the end of the presentations. Looking back, 2019 was a year of continued progress for 1 in 4, but one in which demand for psychotherapy services continued to exceed our ability to supply them, given our limited resources. This regrettably resulted in the closing of our waiting lists for 4 months during 2019. While the challenges of adequately resourcing organisations such as 1 in 4 are well known, the situation with COVID has added great impetus to redouble our efforts as a society to adequately fund such important work, given the very negative ramifications if we do not succeed in this regard. To that end, I would like to thank our supporters, the statutory agencies that help fund 1 in 4's work, the HSE, TUSLA and the Department of Justice in particular, and also our corporate and individual donors, which continue to support 1 in 4, particularly those individuals who undertook fundraising events in recent months. Their efforts were most well took by the organisation. Within 1 in 4, we completed an organisational review during 2019, and I'm delighted that the output of which saw the creation of several new roles within the organisation, including Deputy CEO, and we also saw the promotion of an internal candidate to Clinical Director, and I wish continued success to everybody in their new positions. As a board of directors, we continue to operate at a very high level, ensuring that the highest standards in corporate governance and risk management are being met at all times. I'd like to extend thanks to my fellow directors for their contribution during the year, and particularly highlight the excellent ongoing work of the board committees during COVID. On behalf of the board, I would also like to thank the staff of 1 in 4 for their hard work in 2019, but I also want to draw particular attention to the ongoing professionalism shown this year while working from home and continuing to provide much needed services in a very challenging environment. These efforts are greatly appreciated. Finally, I made a request last year for support in enabling an office move for 1 in 4 as our current location is not fit for purpose. And I'm delighted to say that with the support of the HSE and TUSLA, 1 in 4 should be in a position to achieve this long-standing ambition over the coming months. This year, I would appeal for further fundraising support as the stresses experienced by 1 in 4 clients on waiting lists will only be exacerbated by the COVID situation, and we would greatly appreciate continued and indeed increasing support from stakeholders as we enter 2021. Thank you all once again for attending today, and I will hand it over to Maeve Lewis.
Thank you so much, David. And I'd like to welcome everybody who's attending this very strange annual report launch. Looking back at 2019 through the prism of COVID, it seems like a foreign country. However, I would like to show you some of the work that we have been able to deliver during 2019 before everything changed. So just very quickly to take you through some of our statistics. As you know, in 1 in 4, we have 4 programs. Our advocacy service supports people in a more practical way through supporting people through the criminal justice system, supporting people in making child protection notifications to TUSLA, and sometimes too through civil actions. So in 2019, we supported 510 people, and while it's different from psychotherapy, our advocacy officers do have to have a really deep understanding of the nature of trauma and of the very complex needs of clients as they engage with statutory services, which often cause additional strain and a distress. So we're always happy that we have so many male clients attending 1 in 4, and in 2019, 40% of our advocacy clients were men. And it's also important to say that some of our clients, advocacy clients, are with us for years because of the delays that are often there, especially in the criminal justice system. In our next slide, you'll see the type of abuse that has been suffered, and almost a quarter of our clients in advocacy were abused within their own family. This creates enormous complexities, especially if a client is making a complaint, a criminal complaint against a family member. And our advocacy officers are often in court supporting the client, while there are a range of other family members there supporting the accused person. So it creates a very, very complex dynamic that they have to handle. You will see that 17% of our cases were non-applicable, and that refers to the support we give to professionals working in the field of sexual violence who have questions about the criminal justice system, or indeed about child protection notifications more commonly. In our next slide, we'll see the type of inquiries that we receive. And as you'll see, again, the criminal justice system really is top of the list, although many people will have multiple inquiries. And that reflects the fact, I think, that more and more clients are interested in engaging in making a complaint to the Gardaí, and in seeing the process right through to the criminal trial if the DPP so decides. We also get a huge number of inquiries about child protection concerns, and obviously we notify all concerns about child protection to TUSLA. Going back to the criminal courts, I mean, most of our clients will tell us that engaging in a criminal trial is the most stressful and indeed re-traumatizing experience that they've ever had. So during 2019, we had 35 clients whose cases were before the court for mention. Of those, only 16 actually got to trial during 2019, which again highlights the very long delays that are sometimes there in the criminal justice system. For example, it's not uncommon for our advocacy officer to accompany a client to court on a specific date when the trial is supposed to start, only to find on that day a judge isn't available, which may mean that the trial is delayed for months or maybe even into the following term. Of the cases that did go to trial, we had 10 guilty verdicts. We had 2 not guilty verdicts, two accused persons pleaded guilty. But we had 3 cases that resulted in a hung jury, where the jury were just not able to decide, which again highlights how difficult it is to reach the very high bar that is required for a criminal conviction, and how difficult it is to provide that level of evidence in cases of historic abuse. About 60% of our advocacy clients are outside Dublin, and that poses a challenge, for example, in travelling around the country to support people, for example, in circuit courts throughout the country, and that's always an issue for us. When we move on to our psychotherapy programme, in 2019 we conducted 98 assessment meetings. That's really to determine if the person's needs can be met by 1 in 4. And in some cases, we do need to refer to other agencies, for example, if there's a very active addiction problem. But it's really important to note that almost a quarter of the people we met at assessment had attempted to take their own lives at some point in their life before we met them. And that creates a huge concern when we look at our waiting list. And as David has mentioned, in 2019, we had to close our waiting list for 4 months. And that meant that we weren't even able to take a person's name. So we will always wonder what became of the people who rang us, who were desperate for an appointment, and we had to say, I'm sorry, we just can't help you. And at the end of December, despite the waiting list having been closed up until November, we then had 47 people on our waiting list. And the waiting period can be as long as 4 to 5 months. If we look at 2019, we had 93 people in individual and group therapy. And again, we're very happy that about 40% of those people were men. It's very unusual in an agency dealing with sexual violence that there would be such a high proportion of men, but this blows apart the myth that boys are not as much at risk of sexual abuse as girls. And we are really delighted that men feel comfortable coming to 1 in 4. The age range goes right up to our oldest clients last year were in their 70s. We had a couple, but one thing that we do note is that the number in the past, most of the people attending 1 in 4 would have been in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. We notice a growing number of younger men and women coming to us, and that really is to be welcomed, so that people can engage and deal with the fallout of their experience of childhood abuse before they make many of the big life decisions in terms of marriage, parenting, and so on. And we really anticipate and hope that that age group will continue to reach out to us. In the context of psychotherapy, the range of abuse is there in those statistics. And as you'll see, almost half our clients were abused in their own families. And this is really, I suppose, one of the more complex areas of the work we do, in that people are often not believed in their own families, ostracized by their own families, don't have the support of their families, which is one of the reasons that family support work we do is so important in 1 in 4. And the breakdown in extrafamilial abuse, you'll see there clerical and religious, friends and neighbours, and professional, and a high number last year of people who had been sexually abused in childhood by strangers, which is quite unusual, and it's something that we're still exploring. In terms of intrafamilial abuse, you can see their extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, stepfather, brother. But last year we had 4 clients who were abused by a mother or by a sister. That, I would say, is an underrepresentation of the number of people who are sexually abused as children by women. Internationally, we would suggest that that's in the region of 7, 8, 9%. But I think people who've been abused by women find it much harder to come forward, and actually often have very different and very complex needs, which we're learning to address. And I would hope that in the future, people who have been abused by a woman would absolutely feel free to come forward. One of the issues in working with people who've been sexually abused in childhood is that we're dealing with very complex levels of trauma, and short-term work, while it may deal in the short term with some of the symptoms of trauma, actually will not deal with the underlying issues. So on average, our clients stay with us for between 2 to 3 years. And that is one of the reasons we've such a long waiting list, because there is no quick fix, there is no quick turnaround, and we are deeply committed to doing that in-depth, long-term work that people really need, and which really helps them to transform their lives. Unlike advocacy, the majority of our clients come from the Greater Dublin area, and that's really a function of the fact that people come for weekly appointments, and that therefore it's very difficult to travel from further afield than, you know, Dublin, Kildare, Wicklow. They would be the areas most people come from. I've mentioned family support, and families are usually really split when there's a disclosure of sexual abuse. Some people will support the survivor, but other people will absolutely deny what has happened and rally in behind the person who is abused. And the dynamics are very, very complex indeed. So we feel it's really, really important that when there is a disclosure, that type of family support is provided. And in 1 in 4, last year, for example, we had people in our family groups who were supporting a survivor, but who were also supporting an offender who was attending our sex offender program. And families are really torn. Parents who have to balance their desire to support a daughter who was abused by a son. Really painful and very distressing situations indeed. And it's my belief there is not at all enough support for families nationally who are impacted in that way. And last year in total, we delivered 3,370 psychotherapy hours. The Phoenix program, the prevention program at 1 in 4, works with, to date, always men who have sexually harmed children. And last year we worked with 32 offenders. People often ask, why would we do this work, especially when we're under such a strain in terms of resources? But we see this as a core child protection function. We have learned so much from the offenders who've attended our program, and we know that offenders will continue to abuse until they're caught. People sometimes think an intervention program like ours is the easy option, for example, as an alternative to prison. I can tell you it is not. It is a tough, rigorous program, and people have to face up to and acknowledge the enormous harm that they have caused. So in 2019, you can see there the age range. We're particularly interested in the 18 to 29-year-olds because we do know that that age group has the highest rate of recidivism. They're young, they're beginning to make all sorts of choices in terms of getting married, forming partnerships, and indeed some of our young offenders last year were already parents. So it's crucial that they would receive the intervention that they need if they are to go on to live offence-free lives with our support. People come to the Phoenix programme from all over the country. We had people last year coming from West Kerry, from Sligo, a client from Donegal. So it's absolutely my belief that this programme needs to be replicated in every single county throughout the country. And we were very grateful last year for support from the Social Innovation Fund, who allowed us to do some research into how we might replicate the Phoenix programme across the country. In the context of offending, 18 of the men had offended within their own families and 24 outside their families. And you can see there the person that the offender abused within their family. For the extrafamilial abuse, some people abused a known child, like a neighbour, somebody they'd come across, an unknown child. But the majority of the extrafamilial abuse was online abuse. And it really bothers me that people tend to treat online abuse as a much less serious offence than an actual contact abuse. But we have to remember that every image online of a child being sexually abused is a crime scene, that is a real child, and that a lot of the international research would point to the fact that people who begin to view online images of child abuse may well actually go on then to act out their fantasies in contact with a child that they actually know. We had 9 families of the offenders who were we were supporting during 2019, and what we find in those families is that the whole family dynamic has been developed to provide, I suppose, support for the offender, to create the dynamic where offending can actually happen. And our work with the families, mainly the wives or partners, sometimes the parents of the offenders, is to really, I suppose, educate them to how they have been groomed, to how the offender has facilitated a dynamic within the family where their behaviour will be ignored or indeed even supported. And very often families starting that programme will be in disbelief, will not believe the offences that have been committed. By the end of that programme, they will be saying, oh my God, how could I have not seen what was happening? How could I have not seen what was going on? And they will become complete advocates for their children and actually prevent other children being abused within that family system. So when we talk about, they're the statistics of what we do, but when people come to 1 in 4, they come in the belief that the very personal, private tragedy of their experience of child sexual abuse will be treated in a very professional and confidential manner. But the reality is that sexual abuse does not happen in a vacuum. The individual's experience has an impact on their families, on their communities, and on the society as a whole. Most of our clients are not willing to speak publicly about what their experience has been. And indeed, many of them are absolutely terrified that their cover will be blown and that their story will become public. Increasingly, people are willing to speak publicly, and it's becoming more common to see on our TV screens a survivor coming out of the Central Criminal Court and speaking openly to media about their experience and about the conviction of the person who abused them. But we see it very much as our role to give voice to the experience of our clients, because very often they have to engage with statutory agencies. They may choose to engage with the criminal justice system, but if there are child protection concerns, TUSLA, the Child Protection Services, have to be notified. So we see it very much as our role to engage with policymakers and at every level to ensure that statutory processes are fit for purpose, and that when our clients engage with those purposes or those processes, they are not further traumatised and hurt. In terms of child protection, we make normally about 90 child protection notifications to TUSLA each year. Generally, they will be third-party notifications in that it will be us as mandated professionals who make the notifications, and usually there are fewer than 10 of our clients who actually wish to meet a social worker. Now, we were really pleased in 2019 when we learned that TUSLA were about to publish a new protocol for investigating allegations of child abuse, and that there would be consistent practices throughout the country. When we read the new policy, we were absolutely dismayed to really see that the new policies and protocols were really prioritising the rights of the alleged offender to due process, which of course we support, but were not taking into account the rights that exist for very vulnerable adults who have been victims of sexual abuse. For example, even if an investigation, the circumstances are not clear when, for example, the name of the person making the complaint will be passed on to the offender. This causes us great concern because that may place many of our clients in danger of intimidation, physical violence, or even worse. There is also a situation where during an investigation, the offender may have the right to cross-examine a survivor of abuse. And that will be over my dead body that happens to any of our clients, but it may well be that people walk into that process without realizing what's going to happen and may find themselves in that situation. That is totally, utterly unacceptable. So we're now working with a number of other agencies working in the field of sexual violence, and indeed the professional bodies for the psychotherapy professions, to come up and to engage with TUSLA in drawing to their attention the very real difficulties that lie there, and that's an ongoing process through 2020 and into 2021. In terms of the criminal justice system, unfortunately, our clients still describe their experience of the criminal trial as dehumanizing, stressful, humiliating, re-traumatizing. Now, there have been many improvements in recent years. For example, the Sex Offences Bill of 2017 will possibly change some of the ways in which victims of sexual crime are dealt with in the courts, and through things like pre-trial hearings and so on, may well lessen the delays that can happen in the criminal justice process. We also welcome the publication of the Professor Tom O'Mahony review of the trial of sexual offences, which has just been published in the autumn of 2020, and we welcome the fact that the new Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, has said that and stated that she intends to implement fully all his recommendations, and indeed the Department of Justice are currently drawing up a list of implementation practices. So we look forward to seeing how that may go. But we cannot, I suppose, understate how challenging the experience of being a complainant witness in a trial of sexual offences can be, and how people absolutely need the support of experienced expert professionals to assist them through that process. So that was 2019, a very challenging year, but little did we think what we would be facing in 2020. Our offices closed in the middle of March, and we had put plans in place and immediately switched to delivering our services online. But this has been an incredibly difficult time for our clients. All the normal scaffoldings of life, work, taking kids to school, social events with family and friends and so on, have been removed, and people have been left very much to their own devices. Now, we're all, I think, living in a state of some anxiety about COVID and the possibility of infection. But that level of anxiety in a person who is experiencing complex trauma absolutely highlights the trauma. So our clients are telling us that they have increased levels of intrusive memories about the abuse, and that is causing heightened levels of distress. Some of our clients are suicidal. Some of our younger clients have had to go home to the families where they were abused originally. Other clients are telling us about increased levels of violence by intimate partners as they were more cut off from families and friends. So people are really, really having a very, very tough time. We're very concerned about our waiting list again, and we are very worried that because we're now offering mainly online services, that it's quite difficult to form the deep therapeutic relationship that is needed with people we're meeting online in a very disembodied way for the first time. So as 2020 goes on, we are, I suppose, anticipating that we may be in this position for another 6 to 9 months, and we're really working very hard to find creative ways to deliver our services, both individual and group services, online. So finally, I would like to say some thanks. I'd like to very much thank our statutory funders, as David has already done, the HSE, TUSLA and the Department of Justice, who have been stalwart supportive of us over the years, our corporate supporters and the individual supporters who have done so much, especially this year since COVID happened, engaging with us online for fundraising events. I mean, our fundraising is going to be down 25 to 30% this year. We've had to cancel all our fundraising events, including just next week, an Irish Camino on St. Declan's Way, because of the heightened risk of COVID again. So we're really, really grateful to them. I'd like to thank our board who have been stalwarts, especially through COVID, but through the subcommittees of the board that David mentioned, the Audit, Risk and Finance Committee and the Governance Committee, ensure that we are meeting the highest standards of governance and meeting all the requirements of the charity regulator in a way that I think is probably quite unique for a small charity like 1 in 4. Finally, I'd like to thank the staff. I am so proud of the staff and the way that they have coped with the changes in 2020. They seamlessly moved from face-to-face work to online work, but I know that has been really challenging. It's very different to be sitting at home dealing with very distressing material coming into your own private space without the normal support that would be there from the other team members here. It's been difficult for everybody, but I just want to say how much I appreciate that. Now, we've been talking about statistics, but we have to remember there are real people behind those statistics. So I'd like now just to show you a very short video where some of our clients describe how they have benefited from their engagement with 1 in 4. Thank you.
I tried to take my life 5 times before I came to 1 in 4. I'm still in therapy and it is really tough, but I know now I want to live. They took my childhood, but they won't take my 40s.
I lived with panic attacks. And I dropped out of college. I hated myself and my life. 3.5 years later, fear is gone, and I'm going back to college.
It's hard to describe the difference it makes having someone who gets it supporting you. I reached out with questions about reporting what happened to me, and I was met with understanding and insight. It gave me a chance to breathe and make decisions that were the right ones for me.
My family didn't believe or support me when I told them who abused me. I felt I couldn't survive without them in my life. The grief was devastating. It took time, but the work I did in 1 in 4 allowed me to do more than just survive. I now have a loving wife and 2 beautiful children and lots of hope for the future.
A very powerful video there, really showing the impact that the very important work that 1 in 4 does have on a daily basis with clients, and again highlighting what both myself and Maeve have said earlier of just how important it is in 2020 and beyond that we continue to look to fund these services. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Conor O'Mahony, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Law at University College Cork, where he teaches and researches in the areas of constitutional law and children's rights. He also directs the Child Law Clinic, which provides research assistance to support litigation and advocacy work on issues affecting children. The clinic is best known for its works on securing redress for survivors of historical abuse in day schools, including the Louise O'Keeffe case and subsequent related work. Dr. O'Mahony was appointed by the government as Special Rapporteur on Child Protection in 2019, and his report for 2020 will make detailed proposals in respect of the legal regulation of investigations of complaints of abuse. So Conor, you're very welcome, and I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to Maeve for the invitation to launch the report, which I'm very honoured to do. 1 in 4 has done such tremendous work for survivors of child sexual abuse for many years in Ireland, and really is such a key component and key piece of the puzzle in ensuring that the rights of survivors are adequately catered for. And so I was delighted to be asked to be part of this event today. I think a couple of the points that Maeve mentioned really tie in with some of the work I've been doing recently. And one of the things that came up around 2019 was the issue of the waiting lists and delays in the services. And so in spite of all the fantastic work that 1 in 4 does, there is a systemic issue really in Ireland with under-resourcing of services to support survivors of child sexual abuse. And this arises both in the context of therapy and advocacy services, but also in the context of the delays that were mentioned in court proceedings relating to criminal trials and so on. And this was highlighted during 2019 by the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. And so in my report for 2020, again, it's an issue that I'm going to be calling attention to, that we need more of these kind of services, that the work that's being done is fantastic, but we need more resources, we need more investment and more provision to support this kind of work, because the demand currently does seem to outstrip the supply of these services. The issue of COVID was mentioned, of course. It is in some ways possibly a little bit early to make firm judgments about how COVID has impacted on the whole area of child protection. You know, what we do know is that it has had a very damaging impact in many ways. We know that the mantra of stay home and stay safe doesn't really work for children for whom home is not a safe place. We know that information flow has been a difficulty, that sources of information on child protection like schools and hospitals weren't seeing children, and that created a fall off in referrals. And we know that there was a major spike in referrals. A Europol report in June in relation to online child sex abuse material noted that during the lockdown period, and particularly in March and April, that there was a very significant spike in the number of referrals made to Europol in relation to child sex abuse material online, including from Ireland. During April, the number of referrals was 3 times what it would be in an average month. So these are all very significant concerns, but we've also heard from Maeve about how the pandemic didn't just impact on children currently at risk of abuse, but also has very much impacted in a very significant way on survivors of abuse in their process in accessing therapeutic services and in interacting with investigations, be they child protection investigations or criminal investigations. And so it's in that context, I really want to commend everybody at 1 in 4 for the very agile and creative way that they responded to that particular shift in circumstances and sought to do as much as they possibly could and do much of it quite successfully through an online medium, which isn't easy to do. It obviously isn't a substitute for face-to-face interaction, but it's really a credit to everybody in the organisation that they responded so quickly and did so much to try and provide the very best that they could in the difficult circumstances in which we now find ourselves. What I want to focus on for my remarks are a couple of the points mentioned by Maeve, particularly in the context of the issue of investigations of what we know as retrospective or historical complaints of child sexual abuse. And Maeve mentioned 2 points in particular that have been a focus of a lot of discussion and concern in recent months. And those two issues were, first of all, the issue of privacy concerns and the handling of data relating to complaints which TUSLA receives, and the point at which information about those complaints is shared with the person who is the subject of those complaints. And the other point was the issue of how investigations test evidence and how they handle the whole issue of challenging evidence through questions being put to a complainant up to and potentially including cross-examination. So those two issues are very significant concerns, all related to the draft CASP policy, which TUSLA was due to launch this year, but which has now been pushed back until next year. Now, I very much empathise with people who are extremely concerned about those points. They are points of significant concern, and they do render the process really unfit for purpose from the perspective of being sensitive to the needs of people who may wish to make complaints, or indeed people who may not actually make a complaint directly to TUSLA, but whose complaint may find its way to TUSLA via the mandatory reporting laws. At the same time, this is part of a very complex legal picture. And so on the one hand, there is a question of what can TUSLA do within its own policies at the moment. But then there is also a question of the legal constraints within which TUSLA operate. And certainly when we look at those two issues, on the question of data protection and the passing of information, that's an extremely complex area of law. There is possibly some scope for a different interpretation of that law, and I'll be elaborating on that in my report, which will be published soon. But at the same time, there is a reality that TUSLA must operate within data protection laws. On the other question, the question of testing of evidence, when the news broke and when the media coverage of that issue happened during the year, there was on the one hand a very understandable reaction to that the prospect of cross-examination, I share Maeve's view on that. It's not something which anybody making a complaint of child sexual abuse should be subjected to, certainly not direct cross-examination by the person who the complaint relates to. There is simply no question that should be allowed to happen. At the same time, the draft policy at that time made it clear that would not happen in any case where a person didn't wish it to happen. It gave the complainant an absolute veto over that. To an extent that perhaps got a little bit lost in some of the media coverage of it. But nonetheless, the entire way that the policy is framed is not how we should be going about dealing with these issues. It is a product of a legal environment where TUSLA is put in a very difficult position, where TUSLA social workers dealing with retrospective complaints are asked to be both the investigators of those complaints and the adjudicators on those complaints, but without having any of the legal powers that investigators or adjudicators might have in a criminal process. And what has happened over the years is that TUSLA policies have been repeatedly challenged in courts, and the law has developed through court challenges rather than through a carefully planned set of legislation. And court judgments continuously move the goalposts for social workers conducting these investigations. And this isn't a satisfactory way of handling the regulation of what should be a carefully designed and very sensitive process which balances the rights of both parties. Instead, it has developed in a very ad hoc way. Now, notwithstanding the fact that the law has developed through the medium of High Court decisions rather than through carefully planned legislation, TUSLA cannot ignore those High Court decisions. And it's important to remember that if TUSLA simply decides to draft policy or apply policy in a way that ignores elements of those High Court decisions that it doesn't like, the result of that will be further High Court challenges. And those challenges will result in investigations being thrown out. And that is damaging from the perspective of achieving closure for the complainant. And it's also damaging from the perspective of achieving child protection through identifying people who pose risks to children in the future. So TUSLA cannot simply ignore those High Court decisions. It cannot draft its policies in a way that disregards them. It is at the mercy to an extent of the Oireachtas. The solution to these difficulties really lies in the hands of the Oireachtas. We need new laws which will provide a different approach and which will address some of the difficulties that we've seen around the question of how evidence is assessed and challenged during investigations, and how privacy concerns are addressed as well. And this is an issue which isn't new. It was raised by Geoffrey Shannon, the previous Special Rapporteur on Child Protection, in his report in 2018. It was raised in 2019 by an expert assurance group established by the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, of which I was a member. And it was raised as recently as June of this year by the High Court in a judgment in which a challenge was taken against one of these investigations. So there is a very clear need for the Oireachtas to act and to legislate to provide a new and better approach for dealing with the investigation of retrospective complaints of abuse. And that's something which I've been working on in a lot of detail during the course of 2020. And in my annual report as Special Rapporteur, which was completed in June and which has been submitted to the government and which will be published once it's been laid before the Oireachtas, I examine these flaws in a lot of detail and make a series of recommendations and proposals for a new framework which would address some of these flaws. And that framework will have 4 key priorities. One is to provide a robust statutory basis for the balance of rights between the complainant, between other children at risk of abuse, and the rights of the person subjected to the abuse allegation. The new laws should separate out the investigative function from the decision-making function, so that the social workers who are charged with investigating the complaint shouldn't find themselves also acting as the adjudicators on that complaint and whether or not there is a real child protection risk. The process needs to be streamlined to make it more sensitive to the needs of complainants, to reduce the very difficult burden currently placed on some social workers trying to conduct these investigations, while at the same time still maintaining protection for the constitutional rights of the person who is subject to the allegation. And finally, the data protection issues around privacy and the handling of information relating to the complaint also need to be addressed. So there's quite a number of things that need to be done, and quite a few of these will require legislation to be passed by the Oireachtas. They cannot be addressed by TUSLA acting alone through its policy documents. So from that perspective, there's a very detailed set of proposals. I won't get bogged down in the detail of them now. I'm looking at the clock and see I have about 3 minutes left, so I won't have time to get into the detail of those. But just to flag to you that there's been a lot of work gone into that. There's been a lot of dialogue on an ongoing basis throughout the year with the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. They're very eager to move forward and to address these issues. The legislative process takes time. It will require collaboration between that department and the Department of Justice. So this isn't something that can happen in the space of a month or two. But I do think there is a will there to move forward and to address the concerns that have been rightly expressed about the way these issues are handled at the moment. And so, as I said, that the detail on my recommendations on that will be appearing in the public domain, hopefully at some point during October or at the latest November. The other point which is mentioned in the annual report, which I want to speak about briefly, is the issue of redress for survivors of abuse in day schools, following on from the Louise O'Keeffe judgment in 2014. And during 2019, people might recall that there was an independent assessor appointed by the government, Mr. Justice Irlo O'Neill, who reviewed the ex gratia scheme which had been established following the O'Keeffe judgment. And he found ultimately that ex gratia scheme did not actually comply with the terms of the Louise O'Keeffe judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, which is something that those of us who had worked on the Louise O'Keeffe case at the time had been saying from the outset, that the requirement that people had to demonstrate a prior complaint had been made before they were abused if they were to be eligible for redress was incompatible with the O'Keeffe case, and Mr. Justice O'Neill's report confirmed that. So that was in July of 2019. We are now in October of 2020. It is a matter of great regret that the government, in spite of having committed in July 2019 to implementing that recommendation and to reopening the redress scheme with that requirement removed, has still not done so. And the COVID pandemic is no excuse for that, because this issue arose 6 months before anybody ever even heard of COVID-19. And so really it's been extremely disappointing that the previous government didn't address that issue before the election took place in February. And equally, now that the new government is in place, it really should be recalled that when in opposition, members of the new government were very outspoken on this issue. We have been told on many occasions that the Department of Education is conducting a review on this, but that review has dragged on and on. And so really, it's entirely unacceptable that no action has yet been taken to complete that review and to reopen the scheme with the condition of prior complaint removed from the eligibility criteria. And other aspects that need to be addressed as well, more technical in nature, which I won't get into now. But again, that is flagged in detail in my annual report, and I'm continuing to press with the government for speedy action on that. That really the ongoing delays in this are entirely unacceptable, and we really need to see action to bring this to a conclusion and to implement the human rights obligations of the state as set out in the Louise O'Keeffe judgment. And so I won't be forgetting that point as long as it remains unresolved. So that's really what I want to say for my remarks. I seem just at 15 minutes. So again, I just want to commend everybody at 1 and 4 for the fantastic work they're doing, and to thank Maeve and everybody else at 1 and 4 for inviting me to speak as part of this launch. And I guess I officially declare the report launched. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Conor. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and I'm sure myself, Maeve, and everybody else on the call today, but also within 1 and 4, very much look forward to reading your report once it gets published in the not too distant future. Just to remind everybody, if you do have any questions for any of the panelists, if you did just want to drop it into the Q&A function in Zoom, just at the bottom tab, we'd be happy to answer them. A few questions have come in, which I'll put to Conor and Maeve. Maeve, a question around funding and ultimately how has fundraising been impacted by COVID, if you just had any thoughts around that.
Well, I did mention that our fundraising function has really been impacted by COVID. We've had to cancel all our fundraising events this year and move online. Now, I mean, I would commend our fundraising team, John and Eva, who have managed to, through online events, generate significant funding. But we anticipate our funding is going to be down by about 1/3 maybe this year. And while that has been made up to a small extent by special grants like the sustainability grant, it does mean that, you know, we're really, really struggling for the resources we need, given the huge demand there is there for our service. So, I mean, I would say to anybody who's listening, I mean, we're grateful for all our corporate and individual supporters, but anybody who's listening to this, if they feel like supporting us, if you just log on to 1and4.ie, there's lots of details about different ways that you could do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Maeve. And a follow on to that, obviously, we spoke before about the waiting list, and obviously that is definitely impacted by the level of funding that we receive. Just on the status of waiting lists this year, and if you expect them to have to close again.
Again, we're worried. We have currently, actually the exact numbers going out of my head, somewhere in the 40s on our waiting list right now. Once it goes beyond 50, 55, it means that the waiting period extends into 7, 8, 9 months, a year maybe, and that is just not an ethical position to put people on, to have them languishing on a waiting list. We hope we won't have to close. We are lucky we've got a new therapist on board, thanks to the support of TUSLA, and we're hoping that will help us deal with to reduce the waiting list. But for example, because of COVID, normally we would have an internship program where we would take people who finished their training but are working towards accreditation. Because of COVID, we believe we can't do that. So all that's impacting on the numbers of people waiting.
Okay, very good. And I think just one final question, and I'll leave this open to both Maeve and Conor if Conor wants to add anything. But what is the biggest challenge for clients in the criminal justice system currently?
Conor might like to take that.
I mean, it's hard to pin down just one. I guess in the criminal context, there's a basic reality in the criminal context, because of the fact that the burden of proof is set at beyond all reasonable doubt, is such a demanding standard to meet. And in the context of child sexual abuse cases, there are so many challenges in trying to meet that standard, related to the lack of evidence, the lack of witnesses, the lack of forensic evidence, if you're dealing with something that happened a long time ago, passage of time. You know, it's just an incredibly demanding standard to meet. And when you combine that then with the adversarial nature of the process, it means that anybody pursuing a complaint in the criminal system is put in the position of going into a very adversarial process, trying to meet that very demanding standard, and faced with a legal defense team whose purpose in that adversarial model is to do everything they can and use all the tools at their disposal to defend the position of their client. And so by its nature, that process is always going to be extremely difficult for somebody who's already dealing with the trauma of child sexual abuse. And it's, it's difficult to know really the extent to which you can tinker at the edges of that in the criminal context. In the civil context, and just to stress, the recommendations I make in my report are not on the criminal side of it, they're on the child protection side in relation to the work TUSLA is doing to work to prevent future abuse cases from arising, rather than relating to securing a conviction for a past case of abuse. And in that context, you can work on a different set of standards. You can look at the balance of probabilities as it is currently looking at, or in my report, I'll be recommending a move away from even that standard and more towards a professional judgment standard of bona fide concern. And there's more you can do then, and you have more flexibility. But in the criminal context, as long as we have an adversarial criminal system, you can try to tinker at the edges, but it will always at its heart be adversarial. And that is always going to be very challenging. And we've seen it in the child care proceedings in the district court context, where you have the state seeking care orders, for example, to take children into care. That model is supposed to be a hybrid inquisitorial adversarial model, but all of the evidence is that ultimately it's situated in an adversarial court system, and so it's highly adversarial. And so there's always going to be a limit to what you can do to take the sting out of that adversarial process.
Okay, thanks very much. I think that answers all of the questions we've received in. So again, once again, thank you all for attending today. I hope you stay in touch with 1 in 4 and continue to support the organisation. And with that, I'll draw everything to a close. So thanks again to Maeve and to Dr. O'Mahony, and stay safe.